Morning, everyone. We're so excited to have you all join us this morning. First, I just want to give a special love and shout out to all of our VIP folks that are on helping to put this together. It has been in the works for quite some time, so special love and thanks to Mauricio, Dorothy, Aaron, and Brian. We appreciate your guys' love and support to help our veterans. You guys do it every day, and you're constantly pushing the envelope, making sure we're getting them what they need and the support. And I truly appreciate it. And I'm so grateful to be part of it. I know Tram is as well. We love you guys, and we're very excited to do this presentation for you today. As Mauricio said, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be monitoring that throughout today's presentation, and we'll do our best to answer them either during the slides or at the end of the slide deck presentation today. All right, so let's go ahead and just dive right on into this. And you can read about our bios later, but today what we're planning to do is kind of hit the top 5 reasons why you're going to want to or need to budget for your indirect rate. So it's the who, what, when, where, why. Okay, come on, Donna, let's give this to us. And then we're going to talk about some of the pricing strategies, why and how can I use this? And then we're going to get into the nitty gritty of how to do the budgeting. And then along the way, of course, feel free to put in your questions. So Tram and I are excited to walk through these slide decks and kind of spend a little bit more time. So a lot of you guys have had our VIP Start or VIP Grow presentations for indirect rates. And I know that time goes really fast. So we're trying to give you a little bit more. And hopefully you took some of the tools from those presentations and started trying to practice on them. So let's go ahead and start digging into what's next. Okay, so I know we just like to call out the elephant in the room. This is probably what you're saying inside, like, please don't make me budget. I don't want to do this. Okay, calm down. It's going to be okay. We're going to break this down. We're going to go step by step, and we're going to walk you through it. And really, it's not even just the sessions. By the time you go through all of the 4 sessions through the end of this, I think you're going to have a really great tools in your toolkits that you're going to walk away with. So let's go ahead and go into the next slide and talk about what are the 5 W's of budgeting and rate structures. And let's just call them out. Like, who needs to be doing this, right? Who needs to prepare a budget and direct rate? Well, you as a government contractor should be doing this. But I will tell you, for those of you who are contractually obligated, are going to have to do this. So what that means is if you have any flexibly priced type contracts, if you have cost type contracts or time and materials with G&A being applied on the M part on the pass-throughs, like the travels and ODCs, you're required, because you're going to have an allowable cost and payment clause requirement, FAR 52.216-7, and it's going to talk about you billing at provisional rates and truing up to your actual rates. So first and foremost, for those of you who have a contractual obligations, you're going to be having to do this on an annual basis because you're required. But in reality, for those of you who have fixed price or fixed labor hour or overall fixed price contracts, you should be doing this for your own purposes to make sure that you're covering yourselves and tracking to it. So what you're going to do is you're going to need to prepare budget and direct rates in order to establish billing rates. Let's talk about that one first. So that's for you to invoice your cost on a monthly basis. For example, we're in January and you're probably finishing up your December billings or getting those out the door if you haven't already. And then you're going to get ready to do your January billings before you know it in a couple of weeks. Well, what rates are you going to be billing? What provisional billing rates are you going to be applying on your contracts? And what are you going to be measuring against? That means you should have submitted your provisional rates by the end of last year, if not by early January, so that when you start your January billings, right, you can apply the new provisional rates. Now, I do want to point out for those of you who have ever said, well, I did the same billing rates on what I proposed on my contract a few years back and I've never adjusted it. Please don't do that. And the reason I say that is small to mid-tier contractors, as you're growing and evolving, your rates are going up and down, up and down, up and down. Because as you're growing and building and winning new work, your rates are dropping, but then you're adding more infrastructure and your rates go back up. So you do need to look at your rates because they do change from year to year. So you want to make sure you're bidding and billing at the appropriate rates that you need to do. Now, I do want to also mention you should also care about your rate structure. And this is so that you can ensure that your business is staying competitive in the market space. So don't get complacent and thinking, well, I've built out my first infrastructure and my rate structure, and I'm going to stick with that for the next 5 to 10 years. No, my friend, it's okay to look at it and say, do I need to change this? What's my strategy for the upcoming year? Does my rate structure tell the story of where I'm going, what I'm planning to do in the upcoming year? And if not, you need to look at that rate structure and say, do I need to alter that so that I can stay competitive in my market space? Now, in addition to preparing budgeted rates, you're also establishing proposal rates, right? So what you're bidding on. So your provisional rates are also what you're going to use to bid on your price proposals. So you want to build out your budget for the year and say, okay, where am I going? What growth am I going to have for the year? And how am I going to make that accounted for in my rate structure, right? That's the other part of this. So it is saying, okay, I'm planning to bid on about 10 contracts, but of those 10 contracts, I'm pretty comfortable we're going to win some of the recompetes, a couple of new things. So I'm going to make sure to account for that in my budget and build that out so that when I'm doing my price proposals, I've got the right rates that I'm bidding on for pricing. So those another structure and another reason why you're also preparing these budgets. And I wanted to point out that like when you have specifically a lot of fixed price and a fixed labor hour contracts and don't have any cost type contracts, the government's not requiring you to do this, but you should be doing this for yourself. And the reason is because when you're locked into a fixed price or fixed labor hour, guess what? You don't get to true up to your actual rates. It's just gonna come off of your bottom line. Your profit margins could be eroded because you're not monitoring or measuring and adjusting and looking at your provisional rates. So that's why I want you to make sure that because all the risk is on you when you're bidding fixed price and fixed labor hour contracts, take a step back and make sure you're monitoring throughout the years. You're putting your budgets together and you're measuring against that throughout the time. And then I want you to make sure that you're staying profitable and that you're heading in the right direction. And so I ask that you do this at least once a year, that you do your budget rates and then measure against it throughout the year. Sometimes you might have to rejig your budgets depending on what happens that year, and things might come from the sideways that you did not see happening, and you may have to tweak your budgets and react to that. But you know what? You guys are smart, nimble, and agile, and I know you guys can do it. And last but not least, here on the slide, the popular question I always get is, well, where do I submit these provisional rates? Well, it kind of depends. If you have flexibly priced contracts, there's going to be a part of your contract that says, here's your ACO, and this is where you're going to submit them to. Here's your cognizant audit agency that should be getting these proposals. So if you are primarily DoD, you can even go on DCAA's website and see, like putting in a little bit of your information, it might tell you what office you're going to be assigned to. Now, for those of you who don't have prime contracts that are flexibly priced, then what you're going to be doing is preparing these and keeping them tucked away and filed for yourself, right? That's what you want to look at. Now, for you larger companies that maybe have disclosure statements, if you revise your rate structures, because remember how I said earlier, you may need to tweak your rate structures in accordance with where you're growing and evolving. I did want to make a side note here that if you are a company that has a disclosure statement in place, then you might have to revise it. I'm assuming that's not going to be typical of most of you on today's call, but we did want to call it out just in case there's a few of you who do have that and you need to submit your disclosure statement and get that approved. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Or actually, I think we're going to go to a polling question. It's going to put up a polling question.
Second.
Since we can't see your faces, we want to make sure you guys are staying awake. Okay, have any of you ever submitted budgeted rates for compliance for your contracts? So have you ever submitted your budgeted provisional rates for compliance regarding your contracts? Like you have flexibly priced contracts that require you to submit these. So it would have gone to DCAA or any other cognitive agency if you primarily deal with. It could be HHS, it could be CMS, it could be NASA, depends on who your primary agency you support. We're going to give you guys a minute to answer yes or no. guess, are we going to display the answer if we've got enough responses now?
Can you see it
Okay.
now?
I do. Thank you, love. Okay, so we have 22% of you who have done this and 78% that hasn't. So, okay, that's wonderful and very helpful for us so we can make sure to talk some specifics for you. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer the next slide because Tram's going to give you next tips on the next section about the budgeting strategies and reasons.
Thank you, Donna. We have a lot of question on why. I'll go into the why part a little bit because you kind of hit on that. Why do you have to submit it? So I would like to go over the top reason the reason why you have to do it, or we suggest you to do it. So if you can go to the next slide for me, thank you. So the first reason is you are contractually required. And this is the FAR clause that will be in your contract. If this is in your contract, you are required to do provisional billing rates. And it's not that if you want it or not, you have to do it. It's basically submitting a new set of billing rates every year to the government in order to bill any costs, not just cost contract anymore. It could be a cost CLIN. So I have seen that nowadays they do give you a fixed price contract, but your travel and your ODC is in the cost CLIN. And even if with one cost CLIN of travel for $1,000 or $20,000, they have this FAR on there. And this is how you can submit that voucher to get paid. So if you have this FAR clause in your contract, you have to prepare your provisional rate and the incurred cost submission, which is your actual rate, which we can explain later. And then the second reason is just to evaluate your business for future goals, because without knowing your actual rates, without budgeting, what Don has said, when you're growing your business, you have to hire more direct people, you have to hire more back office support, you have to buy more computers. What does that look like? You have to go rent another building. What does that additional cost look like? And then that goes together with just to be compliant with if you had a requirement to keep your estimating system adequate. It's helped you to go and bid new proposal with you using the same budget rate and not factoring in the growth and the pipeline of your business. You might be underbidding your rates and you don't want that. And it's also to look at, hey, your actual costs for the year and look at the future. Hey, did I put any escalating rates in there? Look at the growth that we have in prices yearly. So that's why these are important reason. If you don't have a contractual requirement, these are the other reason why you have to prepare the indirect rate. Can you go to the next slide, Erin? Thank you. And this is to say, when you budget your indirect rate, look at how you're going to and try remodel your home. Everything is the same. You have the same furniture, you have the same carpet. It's more of rearranging where to put costs. Can you put the back office support? It's marketing, it's back office support. We looking at your B&D. Is it more product support? Can you look at overhead? Is it truly overhead? Where should you allocate some of this cost? So you can look at your rates. Is my rate too high in the G&A part? My rate too high in overhead? Where can I shift some of this cost? And should I be thinking about moving some of the facility costs, some depreciation out to service center? So basically just finding the right balance that works in your structure. And again, just think about, you can't really add any more costs. You're just realigning the same cost within the same house. So the furniture in the living room seems to be bigger, but the kitchen might be lower. It's just the same amount of costs you're trying to balancing in the same household. Think of it that way. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on tips how to do that. Thank you, Erin. And these are the good question to ask when you start your budgeting strategy is, how do you know if the rate structure you use is right for you? You might be billing 20% G&A, but are you recovering 20% G&A? Are you spending more than 20%? And how many overheads should you have? Think about, do you have employees more on site or is it off site at the client site? Should you be bidding at a different overhead rate for employees that work at the government site versus your home office? And again, what is the reasonable G&A rates? Have you looked at the market to see if is your rate reasonable for the size of your business? I know that Uninet do have a yearly report that they release that show you the average G&A rate based on your business size. Have you looked at that report? Because it is a free report that you can go and download and look at. And do you need a subcontract material handling rates? Do you have enough subcontracting work that you can get some discount on, where you don't have to go and bid 20% of G&A on your subcontract? And are you going through an acquisition, a merger? Is it good to restructure? These are just a question to ask while you're sitting down to start your budgeting rate steps. Go ahead, Erin. Thank you. Again, going back to just balancing the same cost in the same household. Your cost is your cost. And then if we help realigning some of this cost to make your G&A go lower, then your overhead might go a little bit higher. That's two things to remember when we go through this indirect rates budgeting, to keep that in mind. And here's also more question to consider, things to consider when you go through your budget rates. Ask yourself, what products and services do you offer now versus next year or 2 years from now? So that's why, is it more reasonable to look at the material handling rates versus the G&A of selling your product? How are you different from your competitor? This going out there looking for the market rate will help you compare yours and other rates out there with the same industry, the same market size. What are the customer telling you? Sometimes when you go bid, the government sometimes come back and say, hey, we have gone to another competitor because they have a low overhead rates or a low G&A rates. That will be your flag of, hey, let me take a look at my whole structure again and see if I'm allocating costs correctly. The same thing that goes together with your win and loss history. That would tell you, because usually when you go and bid for something, if you didn't win it, you can always ask for a debrief why you didn't win that proposal. And that would tell you why. G&A, it should have been overhead, your fringe is too high. And also re-looking at your contract mix. Is it more commercial, more government, more fixed price, more T&M, more cost plus? That will kind of help you sit down and plan out how you want to look at your budget rate. And how do labor limit and cost set by your prime contractor as a subcontract? Because sometimes prime contractor give you a limit of G&A. Hey, this is only G&A can go to 10%, 15%. That kind of determine where you want to realign some of your costs as well. I believe after this, we have a poll question, right, Erin?
Yes, we do. I will launch it now.
Thank you.
We'll give them about 45 seconds to get some answers in, and then I will show the results on the screen.
Thank you. So majority fixed price.
Yeah.
But I would double check on your fixed price contract, see if there's any cost CLIN for travel and ODC, just to make sure that that FAR doesn't apply to you.
Excellent.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and start chiming in, and let's just, I know we're getting a lot of questions just a few minutes ago, and everyone's trying to figure out where's the best place to go find out what's a good G&A rate. Where do I go find one? Here's the general rule. There's no one great place that's going to give you specific intel on rates. Our general rule of thumb is for G&A, you typically want it to be as low as possible, specifically if you're being competitive on cost type contracts. So the goal is for small to mid tiers, you're typically going to be in a double-digit G&A. The goal would be to try and go as low as you can to the double digits as you can. And that may mean looking at your rate structure and seeing what can go in other areas or into overheads and try to reduce the G&A rate. Since most of you on today's call has predominantly mostly fixed price contracts, For you, it doesn't really matter what bucket you put it in because it's overall your total rack rate. So you're going to push it from one place, it's going to go another. But what I would say is get in the habit of making sure that your rate structure is streamlined so that if you are bidding on cost type contracts, or if you have, as Tram just said, any of those cost type CLINs, your G&A is not so inflated that it doesn't look so exciting when you're bidding it on a proposal. So again, the lower double digits is where you're going to try and streamline your G&A rate down as much as possible. But we want you to try and look at that and look at your, let's go ahead and jump into what we're talking about. You want to start at looking at your historical costs. That's where you do need to start. Say, well, where have I been and what have I been doing? Where is it that I'm planning to go and build my budget rates in that vein, right? So if we're going to expand into other service areas, if we're expanding into other customers, if we are tackling and adding on a new service line, are we branching out into another state or two? Are there nuances related to that expansion that I need to account for that I would have not typically had in my historical costs? So that's the first thing you want to do. You always want to say, well, where have I been? At least acknowledging it and using that as your starting point, right? And then looking forward and saying, where am I going? And making sure I'm building the blocks in there to get me to where I want to go. And the reason is a lot of times when you're submitting your budget rates, if you don't have anybody, for those of you, the small portion of you that has the cost type contracts in the T&M, you guys are submitting your provisional billing rates, but that doesn't mean every single year someone's reviewing and approving them. You may get an acknowledgement that you submitted it, and then it may be on their to-do list to review it, but depending on what's on their plate for the year, they may or may not be able to get to it, and it may not be timely. So just make sure you're doing it for your purposes and adjusting your billings and adjusting your proposals so that you're moving forward in the right direction, but you're not necessarily waiting for the government to catch up. You can always tweak it if they adjust your provisional billing rates later on cumulatively on your bills. So again, start with your historical information. You need a good foundation of what you're building on. So know where you've been and then figure out where you need to go. Now, what we want to do is then look at the cost in all the pools and the service centers. We love service centers because they're a great way for you to take cost on a homogeneous basis, right? And then allocate it once a month. So the reason we do this is, well, we are accountants. It makes it easier and you're doing less to, booking of costs into multiple places. So for example, the pandemic made everyone kind of work remotely, work from home. So that means you may have trimmed down your facilities. Everyone's working from home. Some may be working at the government sites, but your facility costs might have trimmed down, or you may not have renewed a lease. So then maybe your IT costs grew, but not your facility costs. So you maybe want to house those into particular service centers, right? So that you're allocating them over the appropriate base and pushing them so that you're recovering all your costs, right? We don't want you to not recover all your costs. That's the beauty of this. This is to maximize your recovery of your expenses so that you do get it reimbursed through your contracts when you're billing people. And so, but what you want to do is making sure it's leveraging the cost to the people who are incurring it and pushing those costs into those areas. But what I want to stress here for just a moment is reviewing service centers doesn't mean I want you to create 15 new service centers and slice and dice the pie into 25 pieces. Start with what makes sense for you. If you're starting your business and it's brand new, maybe you're just going to have a little bit of fringe and just G&A. Maybe you're established for several years, you've got enough employees. We're talking maybe 50 employees. We're kind of moving along. We're winning contracts. We're growing. Now we have a fringe and overhead and G&A. But maybe we're a company of 300 or 500 and we're moving along. We've got a lot of contracts and we need a little bit more sophistication to our rates. Then your rate structure could then be sliced and diced in different ways to make it sense for what that business is. But I want you to understand you could be here and eventually grow to here. That's why we want you to evaluate each and every year so that you're growing and evolving and not staying stagnant and doing the same thing year over year, because that's just going to hurt you. Because what happens is when you're looking at your cost and making sure you're putting them in the right places, it's allowing you to maximize recovery of allowable costs. And it's helping you to make sure you're staying relevant and being competitive in your space. Now, you all know what is competitive in your space better than I do. You're the ones talking to your customers. You know the ones what you're submitting that's being competitive and what the winning prices are and what the winning rates are. So stick to your intel, keep your intel fresh, keep it updated, making sure that you're taking the information that you're gaining and then curtailing what your business is doing to kind of blend so that you can be competitive and win more work. And remember, as you continue to win more work, your base grows larger and your rates go lower. And that's the ultimate goal of what you want to do. But it may mean that for the upcoming year, you're going to expand into a different line of business. Well, if that's the case, you've won a contract or you're doing some things that are expanding into it. Not that you have one or two persons doing something different, but truly a line of business and a portion of your business is doing something different. You may want to say, I need to look at this a little differently and build my rate structure for making sense for what we're doing. And it may be like, hey, I'm doing some trainings and fixed price stuff over here, but over here I'm doing customized services that's ad hoc and building custom for each client. Well, the supervision and how those contracts are going to be and how they're managed are going to be different. Well, then you might want to build two different overheads to manage those different lines of businesses. And that's okay, because then you're going to take those costs that's helping support that line of business and applying it to those people who are doing those efforts. And the same thing with the other one, you're going to do the same thing and say, what are the costs of managing it? For example, if you're doing IT help desk, that may be low supervision, low maintenance, and it's easily just cranking butts in the seats and helping to do the help desk tickets. Well, then that might have a small overhead because it's quick, easy, it's rotating very quickly. But then you may have IT services where you're custom building some services or doing some cloud conversions, some sophisticated engineerings that you're going to need. Well, then that structure is going to have a lot more oversight, a lot more reports, a lot more management that's going to be related to that. It may have more complex contracts. Well, then that one's going to have a bigger overhead, whereas my IT help desk is going to have a lower overhead. So look at your lines of businesses and make sure that when you build it out, it makes sense so that when you're building out your wrap rate, you're going to be competitive for those types of contracts. But again, if I only had one help desk IT, I'm not going to break it out unless it's a significant portion of my business and it makes sense. And then, looking at your overall rate structure, what exactly are you going after? So if your largest contract is fixed price right now, but you're going to bid on a lot of cost type contracts, you need to then think about how is it that I'm going to change my rate structure that's going to impact my existing work, but then what I'm going to do going forward. Can we go to the next slide, please, Erin? Okay. So what you're saying is you're asking all these questions to yourself, but I don't want you to go and implement them in your system. What I want you to do is play the what if scenarios offline. We like to do it in Excel spreadsheets to see where the rates are going to land us and what's my overall wrap rate. Do my individual rates look competitive? So for example, for fringes, they can be anywhere from 25% to 40%, depending on what you have in your fringe pool. If you have highly skilled, highly complicated people that are very hard to find and they need robust fringe benefits, your fringe rate's going to be high. Maybe they have clearances and you're giving them robust fringe benefit packages, your fringe rate's going to tend to be on the high end. And maybe you put your bonuses in the fringe pool, that will tend to inflate your fringe rate. So you'll be pushing on the high end. But I would say typically most of our folks are between 27% to 32% on average for fringe rates. So it depends on what you're doing. If you're professional services, that's typically where you're going to land. Overheads, I don't care what anybody tells you their overhead rate is. Don't listen to that number. Don't hold on to that number. They can be anywhere from 10% to 200%. It literally depends on how they slice and dice their pie. So I wouldn't focus on the overhead rate as much as the fringe rate and your G&A rate. Because really it's kind of like the plug in algebra solving for X. It's like overhead ends up being your X. It's the plug, right? So you know what fringes need to be because you need to attract and retain your talent, right? You don't want your competitors stealing them. You don't want the federal government stealing them, right? So you need to make sure you've got good fringe benefits to attract them and keep them because they want to stay with you. Then G&A is the oversight and management of the business. So you can balance those parts, and then what's left over is usually going to end up being in the overhead because that's the rest of supporting your contracts. That's supporting your business. So I would focus on keeping your fringe rate competitive and then trying to push your G&A rate down as low as possible to be competitive. And then your overhead rates in between. And then the last thing you're going to do is look at your wrap rate and say, is that wrap rate competitive? Okay. So when you start playing these what if scenarios, what you're going to do then is say, how does this affect the existing fixed price and T&M contracts? Because guess what? You don't get to go back to the government and adjust those. So you do, if you change your rate structures and your rates change, it's going to impact the profitability on those contracts, hopefully for the better is what we're hoping, right? And then that means higher profit margins for you on that and being competitive on the cost type stuff or the future work that you're bidding on. That's the win-win situation we're striving for. So when you can achieve something close to that, that's what you're going to say is that's the right rate structure for me moving forward. Now, you're going to want to prepare this and review it internally, make sure management internally then says, yep, this is exactly what we're looking for. This is exactly where we're going. And it aligns with the strategic goals of the business and where we're trying to go. Then what you're going to do is once it's approved internally from your business sense, then you're going to want to go ahead and get that submitted to your ACO, DCA, or whoever your cognitive audit agency is. For those of you who don't have anybody to submit that to, or maybe you're just a subcontractor to a prime contractors right now and you're not a prime, sit on it, prepare that budget and sit on it and use it to manage your business. That's what it's for. It's a tool for you to know where you're planning to go and track and measure whether you're tracking to your goals. And then once you've got that all submitted and done, you're implementing that as your new provisional rates and you're rolling forward with that. That means you're adjusting your billing rates in your system so that you can track your profitability from your actuals against your targets, right? And then you can make sure that you're bidding the new correct rates that you want to for where you're heading. Okay, so let's talk into the next slide. Let's talk about pricing strategies and how we're going to talk about discounted rates versus value impacted rates. You can go ahead and go to the next one. Or are we doing a
I
poll
do have
right
a
now?
poll question if you want me to launch it.
Yes, Miss Erin, you go for it. Thank you.
No problem.
While she's launching that poll, Tram, is there anything else I need to cover? I see a lot of questions popping, but I'm trying not to read them while I'm talking.
No, you're
You got
fine.
it?
I have them answer as we go. So, but I'll point out some of the ones at the end so we can go over it more detail.
Wonderful. Okay, so your polling question is, have you ever proposed on a proposal discounted rates for a cost proposal that you submitted? Let us know. Yes or no. And this is you saying to the government, I'm giving you a discount. They didn't ask for it, but you were so kind enough to offer one. Yes or no? Okay. Oh, very good. Okay, so we have a good chunk of you that have submitted proposals where you've offered discounts and some of you that haven't tried it yet. Okay, good. Good to know. All right, well, let's go into the next slide and let's talk about what does this mean when you do this and how does that impact you, okay? So, for example, when you're budgeting your G&A rate, and oftentimes when you're growing or when you're a mid-tier contractor or smaller contractor, you have a double-digit G&A rate. And sometimes it's a little high. And when you're bidding on, for example, a cost reimbursement or even something as a time and materials where you have some materials, travel or ODCs, you're like, oh my God, I can't burden a 25% G&A on that pass through. They're going to have a heart attack. That's not competitive. Well, you can say, I know my budgeted G&A rate is 25%, but I'm going to go ahead on this particular effort, give you a proposed discounted rate. And what that means is you're self-imposing a discount on that proposal. And that means that your G&A rate is 25% is being applied on those travel costs for your time and materials or your subcontractors, but you're going to give them a discount of, let's say, 10%. Well, that 15% difference is going to be affecting your profit margins. And we're going to show an example of what that looks like. But I want you to understand, when you're giving a discount, it's like going to the grocery store and you're like, oh, it's on sale. They're discounting it down to this number. Their cost doesn't change for procuring that thing or for offering that thing. It just means that they're hoping that you're going to take that discount and in that there's either going to be volume or something that's going to offset it, or I'm going to help create it on the labor and pick up additional profit margins on the labor instead of on the travel or ODCs or subcontractors. So I'm going to try and balance that out. Okay. The other thing is that maybe when you have, and we have the word total cost input on here, TCI base, this means you don't have a subcontract material handling fee. It means your total, so you have like a fringe overhead and a G&A rate, And those are my only rates. I don't have a discount, quasi mini G&A rate, which is often called a subcontract material handling rate or material handling rate. You could be doing that on your subcontractors on the pass-through saying, oh my God, I know my BD guy is going to kill me if we try to bid 25% on the subcontractors. I have to bid nothing more than 5%. They want this subcontract handling rate, but we just don't have it at this time because we're just not built in that structure to sustain it right now. But for this particular bid, this is bid by bid. Keep in mind, people, this has got a lot of heavy subcontractors on it. It's going to be a big cost reimbursement. So for this one, what I'm going to do is offer a discounted G&A on my subcontractors. Okay. Again, it's a discount. I don't have a different rate structure. I only have a total cost input G&A, and it's going on everything. It goes on my labor. It goes on my travel. It goes on my ODCs. It goes on my subcontractors and consultants. Everything that's direct is getting this full G&A burden on it. But for optics and for competitiveness on this really big proposal, I might want to say there's a lot of subcontractors on there. I'm going to go ahead and give a self-imposed ceiling rate and then do a discounted G&A rate. But I'm going to know what I'm going to make or not going to make, and then I can offset that and propose that without losing my shirt. Erin, if you can go to the next slide, please. Here's the example of what we're trying to say. When you're offering discounts, I want you to understand it just means that what you're billing your customer, whether it's the prime or whether it's directly to the government, you are giving a discount. And what does that really mean? So for example, let's say I'm bidding $1 million of subcontractor cost on this proposal. My G&A rate, let's assume, is 15%. Well, that means it's going to be $150,000 worth of G&A costs that I'm going to incur on this contract because that's what my G&A is. But on this proposal, I know to be competitive, I can't bid the 15%. It's just too high. I'm going to bid 5%, which means I'm giving them a discount. I'm going to call it out in my proposal and say my provisional billing rates, budgeted rates are 15%. However, Mr. or Mrs. Government, I'm going to give you a one-time discount on my subcontractors to a 5% G&A on just the subcontractor's cost. So that means I'm going to bill you only $50,000 on top of the $1,000 or the $1 million subcontractor cost I'm going to incur. What that means in English is that I'm basically saying I'm going to eat $100,000 worth of cost that I'm not going to bill. Think of it as a non-billable direct cost. So that means it's just coming off of my profit margin for that contract. So if I was estimating on this particular contract, the overall contract was going to make $500,000 of profit, I'm already eating $100,000. So at most I could get is $400,000. And that's assuming I get my indirect rates and funding all aligned. So I want you to understand what a discounted G&A rate means. It means you are assuming costs that you are not going to bill to the government. It is coming off of your bottom line. So the profitability of that job is going to be reduced by the non-billable portion of the G&A that you are not going to bill. It makes good business sense at certain projects. Do it sparingly, but make sure you're doing it wisely and calculating what it actually is going to cost you versus what discount you're giving, and know what it's affecting your bottom line before you make any offers of any discounts. Okay? That's very important for you guys to understand that, because I don't want you to constantly give discounts, and then guess what? You're in the hole and you're not making any money and you're going to lose money. So that's what I don't want you to do. All right, let's go on to the next slide and talk about impacted versus the discount. So that was a discount. Now we're going to talk about what it means when I'm impacting a G&A. Well, because today, once you all leave, I know you guys from now on will always do your budgets every single year, right? You're going to prepare your budget rates based on your expectations of what your normal growth is going to be, or if you're losing contracts, you're going to adjust your budgets accordingly. But sometimes you come across big, huge proposals, things that you did not account for in your regular day-to-day budget for your normal growth, right? So when something comes across your desk that's larger and greater than what you were expecting, I want you then to make sure you adjust for it on your proposal. And the reason being is when you're bidding on something that's very large, that maybe if you're like, oh my God, this is a wonderful opportunity, our business is now going to double in size, right? That's a very different thing than growing by like 5 or 10% a year. This is doubling your business. Well, you're going to need to make an impact when you do that proposal, because a lot of times when you're doing proposals, they're asking you to certify that you're accounting for everything that's accurate, true, and complete. Well, it's not going to be accurate, true, and complete if you don't impact your rates, because if you're growing significantly, you're going to need to add more infrastructure. Let's say you have to hire 200 more people and you're currently at, let's say, 75 people. That's a big change. That's more infrastructure to manage those people, plus more direct costs. So you need to account for all the directs and indirects that's going to be happening. And what's going to happen is your bases are going to get bigger and your rates are going to drop lower, but you're going to balance it by adding in a little bit more overhead or G&A costs, right? The infrastructure. So you're going to need to find what that rate is going to be, and you're going to have to bid that on that proposal. So what you're going to say is, I have impacted this proposal because it is significantly going to alter the look of my business, and I've accounted for all these additional costs and I'm bidding these lower rates for this particular award. Now, that means you are impacting your regular standard annual budget rates and not doing anything else with it except for applying it to this proposal, and you're going to submit it. If that proposal wins, you're going to implement whatever changes in new provisional rates based on the impact. If you don't win, guess what? On the next proposal, you're still bidding your regular original budget, because that doesn't change unless you win this really big award. That's the only reason why you're going to do that. Now, it could be that for this particular one, I'd also have to hire a bunch, and I'm going to be the prime of this really big contract, and I have to hire a bunch of subcontractors. Well, now I need to get a big subcontract administrator. I've got to put a purchasing team together. I'm going to, build out all these subcontractor costs. Now I really do need to have a subcontract material handling rate, because I didn't have that before, but I do need it now to sustain this particular award. Well, now on this particular award, you're going to propose a true subcontract material handling rate, because you're going to adjust your budget to account for that. You're impacting it for all these new costs you're going to incur. It's kind of like saying, I'm going to put this all in place if I win this award. If I don't win this award, I just go back to doing what I was doing and go back to living my normal life. That's what I want you to understand that impact does. It just includes the costs you think are going to happen for this particular quote. It doesn't mean it has anything to do with your standard budget that you originally proposed. All right, let's go on to the next slide. And here's the slide where you may be going, what exactly are these terminologies again? Total cost input G&A is where all your direct costs are being burdened with G&A. So total cost, all your direct labor, the fringe, the overhead, it's going to include travel, ODCs, subcontractors, consultants. G&A goes over everything. Now, what we call a value-added G&A base is when you create a subset G&A, like a subcontract material handling rate. So, what we did is we put a couple of the terminology. Some people call it subcontract handling, some call it just material handling. It depends on what you're passing through. So, and what terminology you guys use in-house to call it. But that means you've created like a mini quasi G&A rate that's a little subset. That's when you have a value-added G&A base. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. All right, this is the slide that's going to illustrate the differences of what happens to your G&A rate. So most companies, when you start out, you have a total cost input G&A. You start out with your business with fringe, overhead, G&A, everything. G&A goes on everything. So if you see the square on the left, you've got your direct labor, your fringe on direct labor, your overhead, travel, ODCs, subcontractors, and consultants. And my G&A pool is being allocated over all of it. So in this example, we're saying the total cost input G&A rate is 19%. Now my folks are pushing me to go to create a subcontract material handling rate. Well, let me see if it makes sense and what's going to happen to my rates and if I can sustain that kind of rate structure. So what we did is took the G&A pool and broke it out between the subcontract material handling pool and the G&A pool. And then we took the costs in the base and broke them apart. So all the subcontractor consultants go into the subcontract material handling base. All the travel and ODCs related to my direct employees, all of your own employees and their costs stay in the G&A. Okay, so now I take the G&A pool and divide it over the G&A base of my employees. And I've now come up with a 24% rate in order to create a 3% subcontract material handling rate. If you can still be competitive with your wrap rate, if you can still be competitive with this scenario, then you would move forward and create the total cost input. But if you said, nope, I can't go from a 19% G&A rate to a 24%, it's just not going to be competitive. It's going to make us look very unattractive on proposals. Then you may not switch to the subcontract material handling pool just yet. Maybe grow out your direct labor a little bit more, then flip it and then go into subcontract material handling rate. But what I want you to understand is what Tram said to you earlier. When you're building out your house and building your rooms, what size those rooms are going to be, it just depends. In this case, let's say the G&A rate is your family room. It's going from a 19% to a bigger family room, to a 24%. But it's okay because I created that little nook that's the office of the subcontract material handling rate. And I really, really wanted that, and I really need that. And I can win a lot more work in this structure, and it doesn't hinder me profit margins on too much of my fixed price. I had healthy profit margins on my fixed price in T&M. I'm eroding it a little bit with a higher G&A rate, but I can stomach it for where we're going because I'm going to win more cost type contracts with this. Then that's the scenario. Then you move forward and make sure that you start using that going forward and start bidding that on your proposals. Okay. All right. So let's go to the next slide. Now this one I wanted to bring up because small businesses tend to be in a lot of unpopulated joint ventures with large members. Now, I want to make sure that people understand that this G&A rate for your joint venture is separate from the G&A rate you have in your business. What happens is, let's say you have a 20% G&A rate in your business, but now you're the managing member doing the accounting and all that stuff for the joint venture. Well, really, you don't have a 20% G&A rate. You maybe have an 18% G&A rate for your business and a 2% G&A rate in your joint venture. Because any cost and time and effort that you spend on your joint venture, those costs and times need to be charged to the joint venture. So you're going to accumulate it in your entity and then bill it to the joint venture. And then that becomes the joint venture's G&A rate. So please keep that in mind. If you are a member in any joint ventures, you cannot account for the cost managing or doing parts of keeping up the joint venture in your company. Think of the joint venture as a prime contractor. It's completely another legal entity. So all the costs associated to running that, doing the billings, bidding on those things as a joint venture needs to be accounted for and housed in the joint venture. So when you're doing your budgeting, keep that in mind. We did want to call that out. It gets confusing, I know sometimes, but your joint venture is a separate legal entity and has to have its own rate. So what we did is we put a little note on here. We see these unpopulated joint ventures from anywhere from a 2 to 4%. Some of them maybe 1%, but I would say at least do a 2% for rate variances because most unpopulated joint ventures typically will get a flexibly priced type contract. So if they have fixed price, you might want a higher G&A to absorb any rate variances. But again, that should be budgeted for the joint venture and then reducing the cost in your entity for the time and energy that you're spending on the joint venture, separate from what you're doing for your company. Now, I know you're going to be a subcontractor to the joint venture, but that's different. So if I'm the managing member and I'm keeping the books for the joint venture, well, let's say I spend 1% of my time doing that. Okay, I need to account for 1% of my cost going to that joint venture. The rest of it will stay in the company for what I'm doing is that role. All right, so we will go to the next polling question, I think here. Yep. Aaron's going to run that out for you guys. And do you currently monitor your budget rates to your actuals? How many of you are actually looking at your actuals against what you'd budgeted for the year? Do you track it throughout the year or certain times of the year, take and calculate and say, hey, am I on track or off track from what you've budgeted? Yes or no? Let's take a poll here. And we're gonna take this answers because Tram's gonna then tell you more steps and tips and tricks on how to budget.
Thank you, Donna.
Thank you.
I only left one question in the Q&A for you.
Oh, that's
Thank
awesome.
you.
I'll go and tackle that while you tackle the
Oh,
next piece.
good. Thank you. I will give you some more tips and tricks. I think some of them has mentioned about they don't know what the service center is, so this will kind of helpful to go to this section right here. If you can go to the next slide.
I'm excited 47% of them actually do track that. I'm so proud of you guys.
Yeah. Here's the service center I was talking about in the Q&A. Couple more tips to go through when you restructure your rates or just evaluating it, looking at it. What is service center to begin with? Those are common costs and indirect costs that you have. The most common one is facility costs, right? Your rents, your facility, your utility. What is it benefiting? That's always the question. What cost does facility benefit? Everything, your labor costs, right? Your direct employee, your indirect employee. And this is the question is how are you allocating your service center? um the common one I just spoke about is the facility, and what is the relationship between facility and what is it benefiting? How do you handle your work from home? Nowadays, I think there's a lot of work from home infrastructure costs is basically your IT, right? You send out a lot of computers, a lot of monitors, chargers. I think some company even send out incentives for office chairs and desks and such. And how does this materially impacting the allocation? So that's why you kind of want to look at it and do the calculation. If you were to move all the facility costs in the service center and impact it over your other costs, what does that help out your G&A rate? Does it help out your overhead rates? Just one of the trick that you want to kind of run through this calculation as well when you do your indirect rate, and then make the decision that, hey, this year we're going to have a service center for facility costs to capture all the utility, the rent, the IT services costs in the service center, and we're going to allocate it to our overhead, our G&A, and our direct costs, and make that as your new rate structure. Go ahead to the next slide. And the other one, I know Don has speak a lot about the G&A pool. And again, look at all your costs in the G&A pool. Can some of them be reclassed? You have some BD work, you have some bid and proposal for overhead, and where are those personnel, like the labor, what work are they working on? Is it more, again, I think the big question I always suggest is is what is their work benefiting? Who benefiting from this work? Who's benefiting from these costs that you spend on? The payroll cost in G&A, I see that a lot, but I also suggest that it should go to the fringe pool, right? Again, we're carving costs out one pool into another. That's just something to look at. The training education, is it all in G&A, or some training education can go to overhead, meaning you have a software training for particular products that you can sell. Those can go to overhead instead of benefiting the whole company and sitting in G&A. Human resources, can this allocate it to everybody, like IT costs that we spoke about? Who are they benefiting? Who are they supporting? And then again, going to the labor is looking at who's charging to G&A, the executive charging to G&A, more product support charging G&A, because they should be charging to overhead instead. Again, where are you booking your BD time for overhead people? Where are you supposed to be booking these costs? These are just a couple of the tips and steps that you can dive into your all your overall costs, not just G&A, right? Where are all these labor sitting at? How are you accounting them for? What bucket are you putting them in throughout the year, and where they should be going and what should benefiting? And this is part of running through different rate models and see, hey, this overhead looks good, this G&A looks a little high. How do we adjust this? How do we allocate some of this cost to make sense? And then the number one thing is be consistent. If you're gonna make a decision on that, keep it for at least a year and then change your mind the next year, because you don't want to shift your rate structure so much during the year, because you do have a billing rates that you need to commit to. Next slide, please. Oh, the big one that they always look at is bonus dollar. Where are you putting your bonus dollar? Is it in the fringe pool? In order to be in the fringe pool, you have to look at the bonus plans. Do you have a bonus plan written? Is all the employee eligible to receive this bonus? Because that's the only way that you can claim it in the fringe pool. And if you tell me no, different type of employee in different department has their own bonus pool, they have different eligibility for it, then the best way to allocate your bonus for it to be allowable Efficient is just to have it follow the labor. Put bonus where the labor cost is. Recruiting costs, is it following the labor? Because sometimes we have a lot of people putting recruiting costs in the fringe and G&A, but are you doing majority of your recruiting on direct employee, hiring engineer, hiring scientists? Because those can be, be allocated in overhead as well. It doesn't have to be in G&A. Again, going back to who is it benefiting? That's always a good question to ask. Again, be consistent. That's the number one thing that I always suggest, is that once you apply the cost to a pool, a service center, where you want to do it, be consistent with it, because you can't just put the labor for the recruiting in G&A, but then their travel costs in overhead. So associate costs as well. Next slide, please. And here's one about relating to be consistent. Are you a cast cover? Do you have a disclosure statement? Because if you have a disclosure statement, you have to stick to what type of allocating costs you have to do. You can't change it from year to year, because disclosing statement will disclose how you allocate your costs. So, hey, my facility will be going to an overhead or G&A. It has to stick to that based on what you wrote in your disclosure statement. But if you don't have a cast cover, you could consistently look at how you want to allocate costs. And that's what we have been giving you as tips, how you can run different scenario, different type of rates, different type of allocation, and see what makes sense to your business. And it goes together with how you're monitoring your budget rate versus actual. You have your billing rates, but you want to run your actual costs through your rate model every month, just to see if you're still in line with what you're billing for. What if you're billing at 15% G&A, but your extra costs come in as 25%? You don't want to wait until the end of the year to go to the government and say, hey, my actual cost is 25%. You actually owe me this much. They're not going to like that. So that's why you have to kind of maintain it monthly and see if there's a significant change. I would communicate it to the customer right away, communicate to DCA right away. You can resubmit your billing rates mid-year. And it goes together with running that report for your project. Compare your actual cost versus your budget. Are you still making a profit with a higher G&A actual cost or not? Monitoring, be consistent. I think those are the words that you have heard us said several times in this presentation. Go ahead, Erin. And now anything you want to add, Donna, so then we can move to an open discussion. We have tried our best to answer all the Q&A question in the chat box, but if there's anything else that we haven't covered, please feel free to let us know at this time.
And we realize it's a complex thing that we're going through very quickly, and it can be confusing. But the point is that if you're a one-person company, you're making sure, then your focus is a little different. You're focusing on, well, what am I going to pay myself this year? What expenses am I going to incur? How much contract work am I going to do? And then the idea is to make sure you're covering all your costs and with a little bit of profit margin, so that you can continue to bid on other work and then maybe hire an employee or two, hire a subcontractor or two. So the idea is you have to measure where you want to go to cover all your costs, whether you're one person or whether you're 50 people or whether you're 200 people or 1,000 people. The concept and the thought process is still the same. We need to make sure that we're taking our existing costs, what additional cost expenditures am I going to incur, and making sure I'm counting for that. What growth or what other projects do I think I could take on this year? Can I hire additional people? If you don't put those budgets and those salaries in your budget, you won't have the bandwidth to hire those people. Just like Tram talked about these, having bonuses. Well, if you want to pay your folks any bonuses, you've got to account for it in the budget. If you don't account for it, you're not going to have any spend in the business to make sure that you pay those bonuses. So making sure that you're thinking about anything and everything you want to accomplish for the year and building that out in your budget. And that methodology does apply to you as a single person all the way through to no matter how big your business is and having thousands of employees. All right, so we're starting to get some questions in the chat box. Let's see. We're getting past. Okay, so what the question is that when you are trying to get your foot in the door and starting to get your past performance, what do you recommend as a profit margin? So this is a really good question. Profit margins are typically led by the contract type that you're bidding on. So it's not so much, a lot of things are business decisions. So you always want to price everything out to what you know it's going to cost you. And then you make decisions based on that maybe if you're going to trim down the profit margins. But what I would say is that typically for cost reimbursement contracts, the risk is all on the government, which means you get less profit margins. So you're typically going to be 4 to 6% profit margins, let's say, right? Doesn't mean you can't be slightly above that, but that's typically where you're going to land. Time and materials, kind of in the middle of the road. The fixed labor hour, the contract, the fixed labor category that you're billing, it's fixed. It's a fixed unit price. Well, the risk is on you, not on them. So you can typically get a slightly higher profit margin on that. But if you have the pass-through, which is the cost type CLIN that Tram's been talking about, that one's going to typically be lower. So you're balancing out, what you're discounting as the G&A on those pass-throughs to look attractive with the profit margin on your labor. So typically 8 to 10, 11% maybe on the time and materials. It can be 7% depending on what you're bidding, what that looks like. And then on firm fixed price, the risk is completely on you to do everything that you said you're going to do for that. So you typically will have slightly higher profit margins that you're going to bid on that. So again, it's really driven based on the contract types, what you're going to bid for your profit margins. But again, if you start out your pricing and your quotes, like you have a target number in mind and you did a 9%, let's say profit margin, you're like, I'm a little higher than the target price. Maybe you drop that down to 8% and then it gets you to where you want to go. That's a business decision. All right. So another question on how do you calculate your proposed hourly rates? That's a great question. So everybody's billable hours are going to be determined based on your company's what you're offering for leave, right? So 2080 hours, 2080 hours is what a full-time employee works. And then you just start deducting hours based on what you're offering. If you're doing 11 federal holidays, you back out 88 hours. If you're offering 10 vacation or PTO days and 5 sick days, or if you just only do 20 PTO, like whatever your leave policy is, take those number of days times, if it's 20 days PTO times 8 hours, that'd be 160 hours, and you deduct that to get to your workable hours. So if Tram's business only gives a total of 11 holidays and 10 days, 5 days vacation and 5 days sick, 10 days PTO, then that's what you're going to do. You're going to take the 2080 hours minus the 88 hours for the holiday, and then the remainder 80 hours for leave. And then that would be the net workable hours. So each of you has to calculate your own. Tram, do you have any other good questions we want to do?
Yeah, I have one, but I'm gonna post it to answer about how to win without past performance. There's several ways to win. It sounds impossible, but it's not impossible. You just have to build a strong proposal, right? That's said without being said. Just make sure that you have a good base of estimate. You did go out there to do market research for your labor rates, right? Your actual labor rates, and you went out there and do fringe is usually it's very predictable. You can definitely justify fringe, right, without any past performance because it's the same payroll tax, it's the same health benefit and such. And also it helps to participate in small business program. They have a lot of program out there that has no past performance. Discussing all this with other small business can help you get tips and tricks on how to do so as well. And it's always good to start with subcontracting to bigger prime contractor. Networking would help, right? That's getting into like this will help getting a lot of exposure to other small business out there. And also just focus on the quality of the service and the product you sell. And then
I would add
mentorship. They have that a lot with, bigger JVs and stuff like that going on. That's what be my
yeah,
suggestion.
I was going to elaborate with what Tram was saying. Anytime you could do some of this work to build your past performance, even as a subcontractor, that'll help you. Or just go start going after and bidding work as best as you can. If the RFP specifically is giving you points on past performances, and that's the criteria, if you don't have it, can't magically make that appear. Some things they may ask for past performances, but it's not what it's weighted on. So you have to look at the RFP and see how they're weighting the RFP and if past performance is a smaller piece or not. Because sometimes if you have the best solution, they may just say, I love what Tram's offering, she's got the best solution, and she doesn't have the past performance I thought they needed, but I really like her solution. So I'm going to go ahead and make the award to her, because how I rated the sections, past performance was some of it, but it wasn't the primary thing. So it depends on what you're bidding. You always have to look at the RFP and see what the requirements are that they're measuring you against. If past performance is the main thing and you don't have enough points, then that's going to be, you do what she says. Maybe it's because you did it as a joint venture. Maybe you do it with another partner, and maybe you create a prime subcontract relationship or joint venture where the two of you have the right past performances together to get the points. But again, always read the RFPs, because that's the criteria of what you're bidding on for that particular award. And you have to meet that in order to be an awardee. So, what else? So,
If you want to cover, if they don't have enough costs, for the year to cover, adjusting GNA rate for the next year, would that be making sense?
That's a great question. So the beautiful thing about monitoring your rates from your actuals against what you budgeted is that, I mean, I don't know how good your crystal ball is, but mine's not always perfect, right? Because when you're doing your budget for what you're expecting for the year, you're doing the best you can to forecast what you think is going to happen, what costs you're going to incur. So that's why you budgeted those numbers. But things may or may not go the way you planned. You may lose a contract, or they froze the contract because they didn't pass the spend yet, and you can't, the contracts department of the government agency is not able to give me the next option year. And so the work I thought I was going to have is now delayed, and it's going to be extended out to another period. Or maybe I got an award I wasn't expecting and it hit this year, and so now I have more work than I expected. You do need to monitor. Now, what I will say is that typically you need at least a good 6 months worth of data to kind of check if you're going to be on par with what you expected or not. So let's say, in the beginning of the year, your rates and expenses are going to be wonkers, because rates are determined and calculated on 12 months worth of data. But if certain things happen to you during the year, the first half of the year, whether your rates are going to go this way or this way. And so you want to look at them and calculate them and look at your actuals against what you had budgeted and say, I don't think I'm going to get on track with what I had budgeted. So you may need to redo your budget. You can revise your budget and resubmit it and adjust your billings or your provisionals, so you don't materially, the word is materially, overbill or underbill. You never want to get in a huge overbilling or underbillings. And what that means is sometimes you're adjusting your expenditures in order to get your actuals to fall in line to where you had budgeted. So you don't have to cut a big fat $1 million check back to the government at the end of the year. That's not what you want to do. You want to curtail the expenditures so that you can get your actuals in line with what you're budgeting. But sometimes, no matter how much you overspend or underspend, and you just can't get in line with what you budgeted because there's too many things that happen that doesn't get you to where you wanted to go. And so then maybe what you're going to do is rejig your budget rates and then start billing at new provisional rates, because there's not enough runway or enough expenditures that's going to get you back in line. And again, you never want to get to the end of the year where I owe a big chunk of money back to the government. Now, $1 million to a top tier contractors may be pocket change. So that's why they use the word material. But if you would have to have, a fan on you because you're like, oh my God, I got to cut this huge check, and where am I going to get that cash? Then maybe you need to adjust your billings and your invoicing early on in the year so that you could flush out a credit on every invoice. So you're not it's like a payment plan. So you don't have to cut a big fat $1 million check at the end of the year. So again, make sure you're always monitoring your actuals against your budgets so that you don't get to the end of the year and dig yourself in such a big hole you can't get yourself out of. That was a great question. All right. Anything else that you're seeing that's a good question that a lot of people are asking?
Yeah, if you want to go over, what do you do when you are a subcontractor and your prime rates are lower than your rates bill in your budget? And I'm tackling the rest of them ASAP right now.
So when you're a subcontractor and your prime rates are going to be lower than yours, that typically happens if you're dealing with a prime that's larger than you. They, again, have a big base and they have the ability to have lower rates. What typically happens when you're bidding as a subcontractor, they will tell you, hey, if you're bidding on time and materials or something, they'll say, hey, I need you to bid these labor categories, but don't go in excess of this number. If you truly can't cover your cost in that, then you have to make a business decision and go back to that prime and say, hey, guess what? my rates and my costs won't allow me to bid on that. I cannot do it for that rate because I will lose my shirt. In essence, do you want to pay that prime contractor to be on that contract? If the answer is no, then you need to negotiate with them to say, this is what I can give you. This is my best price. Here's what I'm offering you so that you're making a reasonable profit margin, not like gouging them, but keeping it in line. So that may mean they have to adjust their funding for you as a subcontractor if you're giving them what they need. So it doesn't hurt to negotiate with your prime contractor, but at the end of the day, remember, if it's just one person and you need that past performance and you're willing to do that job at a loss, then maybe it's a business decision you do. But again, I don't love doing things at a loss. It's not a good place to be, and it doesn't make anyone feel good. So if you can go back into the prime and negotiate, then say, here's what I can give you because this is what my costs are. And I'm happy to show the government my cost buildup. You don't show your cost buildup to the prime, by the way. All your rates are proprietary to you. It's not for you to share with your prime contractor, only with the federal government.
I have a good
What
one
else?
here, Donna,
Okay.
about the MSA. I'm sorry, the SMH pool.
The
Earlier in the
subcontract material handling?
presentation, yeah, I'll read it to you. Earlier in the presentation, you indicate you could propose new rates, adding a material handling pool and moving to value-added G&A. If you win the contract, many RFPs indicate you cannot do this simply because you anticipate winning a new contract. Do you suggest wording on how to challenge this through Q&A during the RFP process?
So this is a hard one to answer specifically because, again, without looking at the actual RFP requirements, I don't want to give you bad advice. I would just say if you come across this in a specific RFP, you could reach out to us. But generally speaking, if you feel the need that you are going to have significant, and it would only, you'd be creating the subcontract material handling rate if you didn't have one before, only because you're bidding a lot of subcontractors, right? So that would be the only reason why on that effort you would bid a subcontract material handling rate. But what it does lead me to say to you is a lot of times you get pricing templates where they give you a pricing template for the most common structures they think people have, but you have to bid what your actual rate structure is. For example, it may say fringe, home site overhead, client site overhead, but you only have one overhead. You put the same rate in both. That may go as same thing for when they give you a pricing spreadsheet and they just put fringe, overhead, and G&A, but you actually happen to have a subcontract material handling rate. You still have to fix it into the price proposal where you do burden it with the subcontract handling rate because you wouldn't apply full G&A rate if that's not your rate structure. So I'm not sure if the government person's answering you in a way that was specific to what it was that you were bidding or why they said that. But again, you should always propose what your rate structure is, number one, and what makes sense. So like if you're saying, I'm going to change my rate structure to do this because it's a heavy amount of subcontractor pass-through costs, because what happens is it deflates your G&A rate to artificially drop way too low if you're going to bring on a bunch of subcontractors. And then that's not healthy either. So you want to make a right balance between when you're going to have just a total cost input G&A rate versus a subcontract handling rate. And sometimes, again, we're happy to answer those offline. So if you have something specific for us to look at, we can try and help answer those questions specifically for you. But for purposes of a broad conversation, I don't want to put anybody in a wrong, pin you in a box, but you need to make good business decision. You do always have to look at the proposal. What is the RFP asking? What is it measuring you on? What are the criteria, evaluation criteria? Anything else that we should answer to everyone?
A lot of for example, how many hours are generally with a part-time worker per year? That depends on how much effort you want to use this part-time worker for. It's we can't really answer that question. Either you do 50% or 70%. Depends on what effort, when you propose the work.
And
that.
you know what, for part-time, like when you have part-time employees, I'm not talking about if you have one or two part-time employees. So if you have a company of 50 employees and 25 of them are seasonal, right? Maybe it's seasonal or they're part-time and you give them different benefits. Then you maybe want to create different rate structures around those people because they work differently or they're working part-time. Maybe they only work 20 hours a week throughout the year. It depends. So if you have a good chunk of your business that is part-time, then you're going to build a rate structure out around them. But if you only have one or two part-time people or out of the whole mix, that's not going to be material enough for you to change your rate structure to accommodate. Now, the reason why a lot of people will create a different rate structures or rates around part-time employees is typically because they don't get full fringe benefits. And so when they propose them, they want the cost to be a little bit lower for the part-time employees they're putting on there. So typically you'll create two fringes. Statutory fringe, which is just my basic FUTA, SUTA, what I'm required to pay for IRS, workers' comp. And then you have a discretionary where they're getting leave and stuff, which is only applicable to full-time employees. So they'll get an additional fringe allocation where the part-time or people who don't get the benefits won't get that. But again, you only are going to create that if there's a tipping point where you have a good significant amount of your business that is impacted by that. If you only have a couple of people, 5 people out of 100, that's not going to be material enough for you to create that rate structure. There's lots of good questions. We're going to do our best to answer them.
Is there a rule of thumbs for what is considered material overbill for under? I think you can.
Oh, that's a good question. Okay,
Yeah.
well, here's the answer to that, and that depends by company and by person. In a $600 million company, $1 million maybe variance materialities probably maybe not as impactful. They'll pay attention to it, but it maybe is not as painful. But if you're a $3 million company and you have to pay back $1 million, that's very material to you. So materialities based on your size business and whether you writing that check will be a big problem. So that's why the FAR just says materiality, because it's different from company to company based on your size. So for example, I will give you an example. I had a small business company that won a cost reimbursement contract, and the government awarded them a cost reimbursement contract, but the people who were administering it only knew how to do T&M and didn't understand cost type. So guess what they told the company to do? Bill me at time and materials in these fixed labor categories. Well, 3 years into the contract, we came in and I'm like, where did these labor rates came from? Nobody knew where the fixed labor rates came from, had nothing to do with what they proposed. They were awarded a cost reimbursement contract and had been billing as a time and materials. Well, guess what happened? They overbilled that particular contract by over $1 million. Well, this is a small company that it wasn't very large. So by the time they get to the end of the contract and they owed over $1 million, it was painful. That was a problem because that was going to put them out of business. That's a material difference. We did tell them to stop doing it that way, but they didn't listen to us. So it kind of turned into a not so happy at the end of the contract. But again, materiality will be dependent on your business and what check you want to write, and that's going to be painful. All right.
Here's a good next one, Donna, about the capital to initiate the cover cost to pay employee when they get awarded. Do they typically see how much in the bank the business account has?
It depends on what you're bidding on. So there are particular proposals. They will do a financial statement assessment to make sure that you are going to be able to manage the contract. So rule number 1, when the government is awarding contracts to bidders, they're looking at you in terms of, are you a financially sound business? Can you pay your bills, so that I'm then just coming back later on down the road and reimbursing you, but you don't need me to run your business. So if you're going to have to hire on, 200 more employees and you're a business of 30 employees, how are you going to get there? Do you have a line of credit that you can tap into? Do you have investors? What is it that you're going to do to build up the cash flow so that you can pay out your payroll for the next 90 days before you start getting the cash flow rolling? So being a financially sound business is your responsibility when you're bidding on something. It is not the government's business to keep fronting you money in order for you to do the job. So what happens is you tend to start out as a subcontractor a lot of times, build up your profit margins, build out your cash flow, build out your equity and stuff so that you can then apply for those lines of business, the lines of credits for your business, and then start building out and bidding on larger proposals so that you can continue to grow and manage more. So you still being a business owner needs to make sure what you're bidding on that you can cover as your business and you figured out a way to be sustaining it. Your bidding on this proposals is so that you continue to grow and add more work and revenue that's continually coming in, but you can cover the cost of your business.
I think the last question, Donna, it's around, I think I just need some clarification. He's asking what the highlight to submit the financial budgeting. Are you asking what costs should be the rates? If you want to elaborate on that question a little bit more.
So a lot of these are all really good questions. Thank you for asking all these good questions. Financial information is going to be dependent on the actual RFPs that you're bidding on. So if you tend to do a lot of CIBR stuff or R&D projects that you bid on, a lot of times those ones, they're going to kind of ask you what your ideas, what your concepts. They may ask you for your financial information if you get to phase 2 sometimes, because phase 1 typically tends to be fixed price. There are other ones like Department of Energy or whatever you're bidding on, depends on what agency and what you're bidding on. They may ask you for financial information. A lot of times it's if you're bidding on cost type contracts, they're also going to want to make sure you have a sound accounting system before they give you these particular ones. So it just depends, because a lot of times on the proposals, they're going to ask you for what they want you to submit. And if they're asking for financial statements, then you're going to provide those to them. If they're asking for your budgets that you've prepared, the budget and direct rates, you will provide that to them. Remember, you're only giving these things to the federal government, not to the prime contractor. Not all of them ask for financial information. Some of them just ask for do you have approved provisional rates? Do you have approved systems? Is your accounting system been approved to do cost type work? Do you have an estimating system? That kind of stuff. They will check other parameters to make sure that you're functioning. A lot of times that's why they ask for the past performances, because you've been successful on this type of work before. If you are an unknown, they may ask for a little bit more information just to get a sense of you and get some information. So
I do see hand raised in the chat. I'm not sure how we handle that, Aaron. There's 2 name with the hand raised up for the attendees.
Yeah. If those participants want to type their question in the chat box, then they can go for it. Or if their question has already been answered, then we're all set.
And the last slide we have is our contact information, in which I have type it in the chat box as well for some. If we didn't answer your question in details, please feel free to reach out, and we'd love to have a separate chat with you.
It's a lot of information to digest, we know, and you can replay this webinar later on and try and digest it again. It does take a little bit of time. I mean, we've been doing this for a really long time, and we tend to talk fast. We appreciate your time though, and all the really good questions. We thank you so much.